Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Literacy View. I have a question for you. What if almost everyone is wrong about curriculum? Do we need a back to basics approach? Are we making the right changes? Well, our very special guest today, Dr. Greg Ashman, wrote an article just about this very topic, and we're going to pull it apart a little bit. But first, I want to tell you something about our friend, Dr. Greg Ashman. He is a teacher, writer, and researcher, and has a PhD in instructional design. He's deputy principal right now, and he has the popular Substack, Filling the Pail. He's also written some books. Let me find those titles right now. All right, where are they? I just had them. Here they are. It's The Power of Explicit Teaching and Direct Instruction, The Truth About Teaching, and Cognitive Load Theory, a guide for teachers. We hope, Greg, that maybe you'll raffle off one of your books for our audience. What do you think? Putting you on the spot.
Is this peer pressure? The guy didn't even open his mouth and you're already doing peer pressure.
You know what? We have to do it in front of an audience to see what happens.
Yeah, well, I'm not quite sure how that would work, but yeah, sure.
All right, let's get started. So let's start off with that question. What if almost everyone is wrong about the curriculum? Tell us about what you think the curriculum should look like. And I pulled out a quote from your article, and it was the core academic curriculum should be built around English, maths, science, and history. We usually say math, so that's a little hard for me to say. Anyhow, could you just talk a little bit about that quote from your article and how you see this all laying out for a school?
Sure. So what we have a number of mantras that we use at my school where I teach. And one of them is knowledge is what you think with. It's something I came up with in a blog post a few years ago. And the purpose of that mantra is to indicate to people that our minds, the way that we store knowledge in our minds, is not like a library or a filing system. There's no little person wandering around in there deciding what to select. It's not like in the movie Inside Out. Not the knowledge in your mind is what you actually use to think with. It's active, and it's incredibly powerful. So the way I often illustrate this is I talk about the equation 3x equals 18. Now, our working memory, which we need to process new information, can only process about 4 items at a time. In 3x equals 18, well, the 1 and the 8, are they different items? Are they the same item? If you start to think along those lines, you start to get the idea. There's a 3x and equals, a 1 and an 8. There's also a missing multiplication sign between the 3 and the x. So that's 6 items, but they're all in a relationship with each other, so that you can't just deal with each item individually, so they interact. So that adds additional items. We can see that already the equation 3x equals 18 to someone who does not know what's going on at all would completely overwhelm this working memory, which we have to process new academic information. But to anyone that studied, I don't know quite what it's like in the US, but say grade 8 algebra, something like that, I don't know. Anyone that studied that, as soon as I said 3x equals 18, they knew x was 6. So there's an awful lot to that. It's a really complicated machine, that equation. But because a lot of people have gone through school and have got schemas in long-term memory that can solve that problem for them instantaneously without even asking it to, it just appears. And that gives you a sense of just how powerful knowledge in long-term memory is. And it gives you a sense of how active it is. It does things without you asking it to. Another example I give is I'm going to ask you to do a task. It's the simplest task in the world because it's just not do something. Okay. So here's the task. Don't think of a white bear. Right? Now, it's almost impossible in that situation to not think of a white bear. And this is because your long-term memory is active. It's doing things. So knowledge is what you think with. It's this, and it's incredibly powerful. And one of the problems that we've had in the past 100 years or so is the idea that knowledge is stuff you can just look up. It used to be in libraries. It used to be on the internet. Now it's with AI. You can just look it up. So it's pointless teaching kids knowledge because they can just look it up when they need it. Instead, we have to train skills to make them better at analyzing or evaluating or stuff like that. But it's knowledge that you use to do that. There's no little person in the head that you can train to get better at analyzing or something. What you're doing when you're doing these things is you're using knowledge in long-term memory. So, and sorry, I'm giving you a much longer answer than you probably anticipated, but this is why the knowledge that we choose, that we select to go in, to teach students in school, is so critical, and because it's the stuff that they're going to be thinking with in years to come. And so we've got these two contrasting ideas that neither of which quite get it right. So on the one hand, you have people saying we can look knowledge up, we don't need to teach kids knowledge, that's not important, we'll just teach them these skills. And on the other hand, you have people saying, but kids can't read. And they can't write and they can't do basic maths. We need to get back to basics and forget everything else. Let's just make sure that we teach them to read and write. And often they're quite pro structured literacy, phonics, that sort of thing. But both of them slightly miss the point. The first one doesn't appreciate the importance of knowledge. And the second point also doesn't appreciate the importance of knowledge. If you just try and teach literacy and maths, but not history and science and all these other things that provide these great schemas in long-term memory that we think with, then neither ultimately will lead to the kinds of academic ability to evaluate, analyze, all those sorts of things that I think everyone involved in this wants students to be able to do.
So we've spoken a lot about knowledge on this podcast. And, you know, obviously what you say makes complete sense. I think the issue, Greg, is how this looks. And, you know, Judy and I have spoken about this with each other and with guests and our audience. And I think that's the issue. Judy, you know, we have been called anti-knowledge people because we talk about the importance of strategies and we laugh about that because it seems absolutely ridiculous. We're trying to look at the nuance of the discussion, and your article, Greg, and your views, this is why we chose you to come on, because we wanted an educator. We wanted someone who does the work talking about this, not a marketer, not an influencer. We want to have a serious discussion about this. So Judy, you coach in K-2. What's a question that you have for Greg based on the article, based on our own discussions, and about what are some of the issues that you see? Obviously, he's in Australia. We're here in the US. There could be differences just based on that, but clearly we have some common ground here. What are some of your thoughts, Judy, about what Greg just said, your own questions? What do you think?
So I'm really happy that we're diving into this topic. This is an area I'm extremely passionate about. I think systematically, for many, many, many years now, the system has been hyper-focused on decoding, phonemic awareness, how to decode the words, how to crack the code. But at the same token, I'm becoming more and more passionate, as I was in the classroom, about also building knowledge, building understanding, really having a deeper understanding of the world around us, what's going on, how do we make our own inferences, how do we analyze things. And I think in the balanced literacy days when I was in the classroom, it was just, we asked a lot of questions. We just asked questions and questions and questions. There wasn't a lot of knowledge about how to teach these things. And I think systematically we're getting better at showing our metacognition, showing how, we're thinking things through. But I think a lot of the things that I'm seeing is very skills driven. And I'm seeing a lot of things like today's problem and solution, boom, check. Tomorrow's point of view, check. I'm seeing also things like, okay, is this first person point of view? Is this third person point of view? And kids don't even understand what a point of view is. I'm going nuts about this. Like for 2 weeks, I'm losing sleep about it because some teachers are looking at next gen standards. Some teachers are looking at Common Core standards, and then publishing companies are making things that align with this set of standards, but teachers where I am need to use this set of standards. And who's losing out? It's kids. And I am very passionate about strategies because I think it's very important for teachers to know how to teach certain things. Because if a teacher doesn't know how to show kids their own metacognition and how they problem solve, that's problematic too. And then one of the other things that I'm seeing, Greg, is that it's like a smorgasbord in the schools right now. And it's a smorgasbord where you got to get it all done. You need to do your phonemic awareness, and you need to do your phonics, and you need to do your shared reading, and you need to do possibly your geos, and you need to do your math, and you need to also now be, we were just told there's a mandate now for social studies and science, and we all know that science and social studies is important, but some of these kids are like 6 years old. They're being exposed to an ELA, English Language Arts lesson that's like possibly 30 to 45 minutes. Then another ELA, English Language Arts lesson that's 45 minutes for writing, 30 to 45 minutes. Then they're also being exposed to 30 minutes of phonics. Then they're also being exposed to 10 minutes of maybe shared reading. Then maybe if you're lucky, you could squeeze in small group instruction, although some principals are like, small group instruction, that's not the biggest bang for your buck.
So the question is,
yeah,
how this all in? I think that's
and the one other thing is that teachers are really frustrated. People, practitioners like me in the field, were frustrated, and as coaches, we're even more frustrated because the teachers are frustrated. They want to help these kids. They want to help the kids understand, but also B, learn how to read, and they're just really frustrated and confused.
Yeah, I get it, and it is a big problem. And I think we do overload teachers. My sister has just finished. She's a primary school teacher in the UK, which is where I'm originally from. And the number of initiatives that she was facing, listening to her talk about that sounds very similar to listening to you, Judy. I think you can't do everything, and we do. In trying to do everything, we do make some mistakes. So certainly, I am a practitioner, but my experience is in secondary. I do have responsibility for the whole school from early learning all the way through. But I remember once going to read a book to the students in our early learning centre, and I read this book, and then it's the book with no pictures. I don't know if you know it, but and at the end it says, anyone got any questions? For me, like that, it was like a bit of an interview of me. It wasn't about the book. And so if you've got a question, put your hand up. And they all put their hands up. And then I said, okay, what's your question? And they went, they didn't actually have a question. And because of that level of development, which I just never experienced before. So I'm aware that things are very, very different as you go through the different year levels, and it requires specialists. One mistake we have made, we never intended to, it was never the plan, but we stopped teaching strategies completely. Now, even if you are completely convinced by the arguments of E.D. Hirsch and Dan Willingham that strategies have been overtaught, even they would argue that strategies are worth teaching, because it's probably one of the single most it's probably the most I don't know, apart from maybe phonics and its role, it's probably one of the clearest results from research that teaching reading comprehension strategies works. The argument is that they have been over-taught. So particularly Hirsch was concerned with what happened in the US under No Child Left Behind, where he felt that content wasn't being taught at all. It was seen as interchangeable, and kids were just being given books on essentially random topics and asked to practice these strategies over and over again. Willingham basically says it's like it's a hit. You teach it, it really helps with their reading comprehension, but actually teaching it over and over again doesn't add anything to that. So what we now do is we teach them and we revisit them, but we try not to overteach them. One of the things that you were describing, though, Judy, when you're talking about strategies, I would talk about as modeling. So when a teacher unpacks a sentence on the board, or is writing something themselves, and they think aloud, or a teacher doing maths, and they say, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide both sides. Why am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to be that stuff. That's modeling. Is modeling the thinking processes for the students, and I think that's absolutely critical. I would say that's very specific to whatever it is you're teaching, so it'll change depending on what those things are. And I would say that's
for a second. So you said something really interesting. So you mentioned modeling, and some of the sites that I'm working on are very big on process charts. Doesn't that sometimes doesn't that kind of correlate with the term strategies, though? To me, maybe I've been thinking about it incorrectly, but for me, if I'm showing my metacognition, if I'm showing my process, isn't that kind of my strategy to? Yeah,
it is your strategy. It absolutely is your strategy. I think part of the problem with this is people not having shared definitions. Now, there's no one more tedious than the person that asks you to define all the words you're using when they're commonplace words. And it's a strategy often people use on social media when they're losing an argument, or define what you mean by. But there are some issues. So knowledge, for instance. I think some people think of knowledge as facts, established facts, dates, names, places, things like that. I would say that if you're saying to kids, to solve this equation, we're going to, and no, so I've gone to maths because that's my area. But anyway, I probably couldn't talk as well about sentences. If I'm saying to kids, I'm going to divide both sides by 3 because I've got 3 x's here and I want to divide both sides by 3, so I've got 1x. That's knowledge. I'm teaching them knowledge. I'm teaching them knowledge of what you do. So I'm teaching them procedural knowledge. And to me, that's knowledge, because that's what sits in your long-term memory. It's all the same. Now, if you want to call it a strategy, yeah, it is a strategy. It's the strategy I'm using to solve the problem. But what people often mean by strategies is something more generic that will apply in a whole range of situations. Now, my strategy there, divide both sides by 3, isn't going to help me write a sentence. It's not going to help me analyze a paragraph. So it's really specific to the thing I'm doing. And I suppose when you sort of open the lid and look what people really mean, the argument is not necessarily between sort of knowledge and strategies. It's between people who think that what you teach is very specific to the thing you're teaching, and people who think you can teach things that will apply in a whole range of different situations. Now, I would argue that there's a sort of relationship that the more specific a problem. Let's imagine everything is problem solving. So let's call everything problem solving. So the problem of writing a sentence, the problem of solving an equation, the problem of understanding a paragraph, the problem of coming up with something new and creative that has value. They're all problems, right? So we're solving problems. So if I give you a problem-solving strategy that is really specific to a particular type of problem, it'll be really useful. If I give you a problem-solving strategy that sort of works on quite a lot of different problems, it will be far less useful. So it'll still have some use, but there's an inverse relationship. So the more useful a strategy is, the more specific it tends to be to a particular type of problem. The more general it is, So a good example of this is logical fallacies, which if I became interested in after arguing with people on Twitter. And these are things like ad hominem. So ad hominem is, for anyone listening that isn't familiar, is attacking the person rather than their idea. So if I say, something about teaching of English that someone doesn't like, they'll say, well, what would you know? You're a maths teacher. Yes, that's ad hominem, right? Now, it's quite useful to be able to spot these logical fallacies, and they apply in lots of different situations, but they don't tell you whether someone's right or wrong. So just because someone is using a bad argument doesn't mean they're wrong. They could still be right. So it's useful in a whole range of different contexts, but its use is limited. Whereas if I've got knowledge specific to the thing that the person is talking about, then that's much more useful to me in deciding whether what they're saying is right or wrong. So that's how I would argue it. And so, yes, you're talking of a strategy, but we're teaching strategies all the time. That's procedural knowledge. That's how to do things. That's how to solve things. And thinking aloud and modeling your thinking aloud, I think is really important.
Greg, Greg, can I stop you for a second?
Yeah.
So I'm going to throw something in right now. And you talked about defining terms.
Yeah.
I think we need to stop and define curriculum, because we could be talking about two different things here. And our audience looks at a curriculum like something often that you buy in a box. And that's at least how it's perceived in the United States. Often,
I think a lot of our listeners have shifted, though, based on a lot of the discussions we've had.
I don't know about that. I think some of them have heard, but they still talk about it as far as, which program, and they call it a curriculum. So could you define curriculum in terms of how you look at a curriculum? And then after that, if you could speak a little bit about this quote that you have in your article, because I think it pertains to it. Knowledge that is a mile wide and an inch deep is extremely useful. So it's like a two-part. So one is, what is curriculum? And then that quote, knowledge that is a mile wide and an inch deep is extremely useful.
Yeah,
it's getting wild. Here she goes.
Yeah. So curriculum, define curriculum. I mean, you've given me a really difficult job there. I will try my best. I think, like, we have something called the Australian curriculum, which isn't a curriculum. It's just a list of sort of dot points, which aren't really particularly fleshed out. So it's not even really clear exactly what you're supposed to teach. And so I suppose from that, what I think a curriculum is exactly what you're going to teach. Maybe with some sort of sequence built into it and some sort of rationale for why you would follow that sequence. It's not just a random assemblage of things. And what you're going to teach, I suppose my fault is I tend to see everything as knowledge. I've got this idea that knowledge in long-term memory is what matters. And then people hear facts and dates and figures and, you just want to teach kids to parrot back facts. But no, I've got this expansive meaning of the word knowledge that includes all those sort of strategies that you were talking about, Judy. So it's the knowledge you want to teach, but with the word knowledge in its expansive term, and it's got to have some sort of rationale about it. In terms of knowledge that's a mile wide and an inch deep, this is about it. Yeah, that's about reading comprehension. So what we typically do, and we do this in Australia, and you do this in the US, is we give kids reading comprehension standardized assessments, right? And we give them random texts to read, like it might be about polar bears, or it might be a poem about apples, or it might be whatever, just random, just throw them at them random. And then we ask them often multiple choice questions to see if they understood the text that they've read. And I don't know if your experience is the same as mine, but of all the standardized assessments, that's the hardest one to move the needle on. It's really hard to move the needle on reading comprehension assessments because we know reading involves so many different things. There's so many thresholds. So there's the decoding, but if you've got brilliant decoding but low fluency, the problem is by the time you get to the end of the sentence, you forgot what the start of the sentence was. So now your fluency is limiting you. But if you don't know anything about polar bears, so we've got an example. I visited a school in Sydney a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago, really brilliant school, Marsden Road Public School. It's in quite a disadvantaged area of Sydney, and I went there and we watched a writing lesson, and it was very, very interesting. And the principal spoke to us, and she explained that one of the reading comprehension assessments that the kids had to do, reading. So in standardized writing assessments, this school is improving. It's doing really, really, really well. And because writing is something you can shift the dial on, but the reading isn't improving at the same rate. And she explained that one of the standardized assessments that they did, they're called NAPLAN in Australia. She explained that one of the texts was about a lighthouse, right? Now, the kids she teaches have never seen a lighthouse. Often they've never left the housing, the social housing that they live in. They've never been to the centre of Sydney, right? So they don't know what a lighthouse is. They've never seen a lighthouse. So they were disadvantaged on this text about a lighthouse. Now, what do you need to know about lighthouses, though, to be able to understand a text about lighthouses? Not much really. You don't need to know the history of them, the ins and outs of them, how the lights and reflectors work or anything like that. You just need to know a few basic principles, that what it looks like, and that it has this light to warn sailors so that they don't crash their boat on rocks. Don't need to know much more than that. So if you've got this fairly superficial knowledge of lots and lots of things, then you'll be able to understand much of what you read. And this is probably a quality that many educated citizens would have. E.D. Hirsch talks about what is it, the knowledge that writers of the New York Times assume their readers have, the things that they don't spell out. You know, if you were writing an article in the New York Times, you wouldn't say something about a lighthouse. And a lighthouse is a tower that is put on a rock and has a light to prevent boats crashing. You wouldn't write that if you were writing in the New York Times, because you would just assume that would be patronizing, because everyone would understand what a lighthouse was. Well, of course, these kids in Sydney don't. So if we want to raise their access to their civil right, really, to have an access to the information that everyone else in society has, we need to somehow give them this quite broad general knowledge.
How?
The question of how you do that. Yeah, the question of how you do that.
That's key. And wait, because I could tell you that, and everything you said obviously makes total sense, that they need to be able to have some background, because it's not going to be explicitly said in something they're reading. It's assumed that they have, just from living in the world, that they have some of these basic understandings. Yeah. So how do you use the school day? That's the $1 million question. Yeah. How do you use the school day?
Faith, are you going to pay him $1 million if he gets the right answer?
As soon as I have it, yes.
Look, I think
I do think
it is the $1 million question. Yeah. And also the other question is, how do you determine what knowledge counts and for who? Do we all have to have a certain body of knowledge? Because where I work, it's a very poor school district, and maybe the kids have different knowledge than the kids in my neighborhood here versus, if they were in a different country, or if it's a different region, or if it's in a different neighborhood. Like, who determines what body of knowledge is critical for our kids too?
The second question is actually slightly easier than the first one, because you can do that empirically. So you can say, well, let's take a source, the New York Times maybe, or the BBC, or something, whatever you want, whatever you choose. And what is it the writers are assuming? And you can do an analysis of that. And you can, from that, you can find out what it is that they explain and what it is they feel that they don't need to explain. And you can draw a curriculum from that. And that's essentially what E.D. Hirsch did in his 1980s book, Cultural Literacy. In the appendices, he sort of, it didn't do it. It wasn't that empirical. It was kind of, there was a little bit of, I don't think it was as systematic as it could be, but you could do a really, you might disagree with that, I don't know, but you could do a really systematic study. What you would, of course, then find if you did that is that in places like America, Australia, the UK, knowledge, white Western European knowledge would feature quite heavily. And so then you start to worry, well, if we teach this knowledge to kids, are we teaching, you know, dead old white European men? And we need
I actually heard that actually from somebody today. Yeah. I don't even know who it was, but I actually heard that exact.
Yeah. So what we try and do, we with our curriculum at Clarendon, where I work, we teach these big ideas. Like if you need this knowledge to access power, essentially, and we want kids from disadvantaged backgrounds to be able to access power, then it doesn't really matter that it's come from this particular place or that particular place. They kind of deserve to have it. So we teach that knowledge, but we also disrupt that as well, because we want our kids also to see themselves in the curriculum. So we will put some things in deliberately. I've developed this idea called like a powerful domain. So a domain is something that's limited. So you can draw a ring around it. So you can say that's in it, that's not. So limited. So often topics that we choose to study in school, they don't even have that quality because they could just wander off in all sorts of different directions. Books are great because, you know, the limits of the covers of the book. And then a powerful one is one that speaks to something outside of itself. So this is then efficient. So it starts to go to answering your question, Faith, that we've only got a limited amount of time. So how can we teach loads and loads of knowledge? Well, if we teach things that sort of talk to other ideas outside themselves, then we're getting sort of two hits in one. So for instance, Greek myths. If you teach kids some Greek myths, then idioms like, oh, he flew too close to the sun or something like that, they will also understand as a result. So they'll have the Greek myth and you can do some great literature work there. But they've also got a fund of other things. Another one that is often, again, it's quite controversial in many ways, but is incredibly powerful if you look at our culture, is Bible stories, because we refer to them all the time in a lot of our idioms that we use in everyday English. 1984 by George Orwell, older kids, if you teach them that, they are not just teaching a really great novel and getting some really interesting ideas about the world, but if you start talking to them about Big Brother or Doublethink or something like that, they'll understand what you mean. So you can so those are powerful domains. So that's what we try and select. The other thing is that you'll notice that those sit in what you call English language arts. So we, like many schools, have a huge amount of time in elementary school, primary school, devoted to that. Literacy, English language arts. So we think very carefully about what the content of that will be. And we have a lot of units in English where they're doing English and writing that are based on quite rich knowledge context. So it might be a historical context. One of the things our students study, and I can't remember where it is now, because things move around in our curriculum, but they do the American Revolution. You might think that's a strange thing for Australian kids to study, and it actually comes originally from looking at Hirsch's core knowledge curriculum, although we don't use that. But it's full of lots of really rich ideas that they can apply here, there, and everywhere. But they study it in the English block rather than the history block, which we do have. So so you can't teach everything, but what you do teach, you can be very intentional about and very selective about, very thoughtful about. You're not necessarily going to predict that lighthouses are on the assessment, so you'll teach all the kids lighthouses. You might still be unfortunate, and the thing that comes up is something that they've not taught, which is really why they should change the reading assessments. It would be my point on that, but anyway, we'll move that aside. And then other things that like.
I just want to stop you. You said to change the reading assessments to reflect what they're learning in school. Is that
what? Yeah. So what I would do in Australia, and you obviously don't have this in the same way because you don't have any US-wide curriculum, although I do believe you have different standards in different states that, and again, that's not a curriculum. They're just lists of that. But I've argued, so there's the body that sets the NAPLAN assessments in Australia is called the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority, ACARA. And I once spoke to the guy who ran that. He doesn't run it anymore. And my pitch to him was, what you want to do, you've got this, they also control the Australian curriculum in inverted commas. You've got this Australian curriculum. It says that in year 4, students will study this in history and that in science. And okay, so why in year 5 would you not set your reading comprehension texts in those contexts that those kids have studied in year 4? Because then the disadvantaged kids and the advantaged kids, you've sort of leveled the knowledge playing field. And what you'll now find from those assessments is something about their actual reading. You might be able to hone in on their fluency or their decoding or something like that. At the moment, you don't know what it is because there's so many different things changing. And I made that argument to him, and he said to me, he said, I've spoken to my people about that idea, but if we did that, they tell me, then all the teachers would really focus on just teaching that content from in year 4. And I said, but yeah, like that would be a good thing, wouldn't it? Like you've said that's what you want kids to learn. So surely that would be a good thing. But I couldn't make that case, and people trying to make that case struggle. I believe Louisiana tried something like it, but as I understand it, they've now moved away from it again. But yeah, that's how it would change the reading comprehension assessments.
So, Judy, as I'm listening to Greg, it's so complicated. This is not an easy answer. A lot of times our audience wants a simple answer, and they kind of feel that, they look to us to sort that out. And what we say is, we give you something to think about, but ultimately, you have to make your own decisions about what this is.
But I'm going to say something, Faith, but sometimes even I leave sometimes a little frustrated because at the end of the day, we have data to shift in schools. We want kids to do well. And, as teachers, we work so hard and we want kids to do well, but we also want the data to reflect kids are doing well. And when there's confusion, who loses out?
The kids. The kids. Of course they do. So, and you're right, Judy. So my point is, when you look at this, so Greg, do you have a science period during the day? Do you have a social studies period during the day? Do you have an ELA?
But Faith, I think you should be specific to K to 2, 3 to 5.
Wait a minute, right? And of course, it will look different, as Judy said, in the primary grades compared to the intermediate. And so when I taught, we had a social studies period. We had a science period. We had an ELA period. And obviously during the ELA, if you could pull in some books that reflect what was being taught in social studies, great. But social studies and science were separate topics that needed to be taught and given attention. So how is I guess what I'm trying to say is how the day looks depends on your definition of curriculum, number one. And it depends on if you feel you could buy it in a box for ELA, because that will then impact how the rest of your day goes, would it not?
Yeah. Let me tell you about what we've built here, the way that we do it. So our curriculum is, we've written it ourselves over a period of time.
Whoa. So now that would be something that people would have something to say about. People would say, oh, how do teachers write it? They're not necessarily curriculum writers.
Yeah.
So how do you get around that? Who's doing the writing? I mean, you're an instructional design specialist, but in most places they don't have someone like
Yeah, but I'm not writing everything. I think this is culturally. So in Australia, we don't tend to buy boxes of curriculum, and often teachers are just thrown into it, and they have to essentially plan all their own lessons themselves. And it's a huge workload issue for them, and they don't have curriculum writing experience, and they're not instructional designers, but they have to do it anyway because that's just culturally what we do. And so at our school, we've shared that and we've become more systematic about it. And we don't throw each curriculum out at the end of the year and start again. We build on what we did last year. So we write our own lesson plans, we iterate them over time, we share them amongst our teams. Going back to your earlier point, we have an unusual model. So we have grade prep, which is 5-year-olds. And they have one teacher for the whole day, but they do have separate science and history blocks within that. But from grade 1 onwards, they have essentially a secondary school model. So they will have an English teacher, they'll have a different maths teacher, they will have a different science teacher, different history teacher, different for PE, different, and so they actually will. Usually the teachers move. But apart from science, because we've got like a science room at our primary school, so the kids will go to the science room. So they do have separate science blocks and separate history blocks because they've got separate teachers, so those have to happen. And that's actually quite an interesting little technology because it means that the teacher can't just sort of forget to do the science block or squeeze it or something like that. Because
I have to stop you because that's a cheers right there, right there. They have to do it. They can't.
They have to do it. But here's another thing, though. There's different people responsible for different responsibilities. And what's happening in the States is that one classroom teacher is responsible for everything. And how humanly possible is it to be responsible for everything? Why isn't there a cluster or somebody who helps? Or a different way to figure it out? Because what's ending up happening is some people want to do, I'm not going to curse on the air, half blank job because they're just doing it for compliance rather than doing it because they believe in things and so forth. And I think a big problem in the States, Faith, is I think people do things very often for compliance. People here are, in the States, many people that I know are rule followers. And if the districts are saying this, or if the state is saying this, and the state is saying exactly how many minutes you have to do this or that, very often there's a teacher shortage. There's not a lot of people. It all falls down on the classroom teacher. And the other problem is systematically, I don't think the system is responsive enough to the data. And I think, everybody says data, you have to be responsive. But if the data is saying kids can't read, what are we doing? Or if the data is saying the kids are reading great, what are we doing? Or if some kids are doing great and some kids are not doing great, what are we doing? Yeah.
So absolutely. And this is why we have our models. So if you look at it from the teacher's perspective as well, we haven't got they're regular primary trained teachers. So the teachers teaching the maths haven't got a different qualification to the teachers teaching the literacy. But what happens is if you're teaching literacy, because of the amount of literacy there is, you'll have 2 classes. If you're teaching maths, you'll have 3 classes. If you're teaching science, you'll have quite a lot, like 5 or 6, and so the same with history. But it means you can focus on the one thing. And you're not stuck there. So if our teachers want to, in a year's time, want to move from maths back into literacy because they don't want to lose their ability to do that or whatever, then we can talk to them about it. They can. They often kind of like to stay in the area for some time, though. And they're thinking about maths, or they're thinking about, and so they have this opportunity to specialize and become more expert in those areas. But I would just add as well, the literacy block does include a lot of science and history. Even though we've got a separate science and a separate history block, the literacy block does include a lot of science and history, as well as traditional literature and all the sorts of things that you'd expect.
But because you are responsible, you and your teachers are pooling together to build on a curriculum that you are building year by year and making it better and refining it.
Yeah.
you are not a slave to a program.
No.
Is that correct?
No, I mean, we do use programs. So for specific reasons. So there's an interesting story. The direct instruction program, spelling mastery, right? So we have NAPLAN is the National Assessment Program, Literacy and Numeracy. It's got 4 literacy assessments, language conventions, writing, reading, grammar. Oh, wait a bit, that's language convention, spelling. So there's a 4, and the spelling we've struggled with for years, and it's still not. If you go, there's a website called My School, and in Australia, and you can go in and you can look at a school's results and you can see how it compares to other schools, and our kids do really well. We're generally well above kids from similar backgrounds on every single measure, but the one where we're only above rather than well above is Year 9 spelling. So it's still a thing for us, spelling. And so we had this program that we have a response to intervention framework, or some people call it MTSS now and claim it's different, but it's the same thing. And we've got our tier 1 instruction, 80%, and then we do interventions with kids who are struggling. So we identified some kids who are struggling with spelling, and we put them through spelling mastery. So we gave them a placement test, small groups, did the direct instruction with the script, the whole thing, the tapping on the table, all that, spelling mastery. These kids were then spelling better than kids who'd had our tier 1 instruction. So we went, right, everyone's getting spelling mastery. So we've gone through this process of running all our kids through spelling mastery. And as we've done so, it's sort of gone down the school. So it started kind of in our middle school. But as we've sorted that out, we've gradually filtered it lower and lower and lower. And so that's a program we do. Our phonics is also something called Sounds Right, which isn't really a program. It sort of is and sort of isn't, but we do that.
By the way, Greg, I know it very well.
Great.
I brought it here to New York, so I know it very well. So I think what I should be clear when I say program, I didn't mean for those finite skills like phonics and spelling. I meant, and I should have been clear, we have what's called like a core curriculum here, which is a package program that's called a curriculum. But it's core because it's like everything pulled together for your whole ELA. Yeah. You're not talking about that, correct?
No.
That's the problem here.
Well, we have used bits of core knowledge curriculum. We tend to, we've used some of the readers and things like that. We don't tend to use the teaching strategies that are listed. We do something else, but we've used some of that. So I think I've got sort of a sense of what an American sort of program might look like, but it's not the tradition in Australian or British schools to have something like that you buy in. It's usually just put on the teachers, and of course what you end up with is there's all these burnt out teachers on their laptops at 1 a.m. trying to Google some worksheet that they can use in the next day's lesson. So that's why we've tried to pool all of that and sort of centralize it a bit to get rid of some of that.
Judy, what are your thoughts as you're listening?
I have so many. I wrote them down on my phone.
Because I'm sure you do. I'm
on fire.
I'm buzzing right now.
Well, one of the things that we struggle with in the States is everybody got very excited about the science of reading. So a lot of publishers developed quickly programs. And what I learned through the Literacy View, more and more so, is that you can take programs that are boxed, but you still, as a school, year by year, what's working, what's not working, what do we need to shift? And that's how you develop a more effective curriculum. And I think that people need to move away from just faith, should I say the F-bomb, fidelity, compliance. I don't know which bomb I'm going to throw today. But I think it's like, as a school, being really reflective. What was working? What was not working? And I think that part of the problem was that, the science of reading movement got so excited that we wanted to do better. We wanted kids to know more. We wanted kids to have knowledge. But we mandated some programs that didn't even have a lot of research. Core knowledge didn't make the list in New York City for so many different reasons. So, people were forced into 3 choices. I don't know if there's that much evidence to any of them. I mean, people are going to tweet and write, this one is good and this one is good. And it just feels like it's more of a marketing thing than showing me the hard facts of, is this helping kids? Is it helping kids in similar, demographic schools as I'm working? And I think that's part of the problem. And I think some other things are with a lot of these programs that I'm seeing for comprehension. Are we wanting kids to just read? Because a lot of these assessments are so advanced. And now kids as young as 5 and 6 are listening to a teacher read a test. So now it's requiring not reading comprehension, but auditory comprehension. Some teachers might read the test 1 time. Some teachers might read it 2 times. And then the kids aren't doing that well. So does that mean that they didn't understand? Because I feel like it's a very skills driven model. Okay, we need to know if you know problem and solution, rather than really having those rich, deep discussions about text and really understanding stories. Like even during lessons, like sometimes I'll watch and I'm like, did the kids even understand what was happening? Did the kids know what was going on? Or are they just thinking this is what happened at the beginning, middle, and end on a very surface level and then moving on? The other thing that's very big here lately on social media, and it's kind of overwhelming sometimes, is this whole concept of knowledge building programs. And it seems like some people will say, this is a knowledge building program. And then some people will say, the program you're doing is not a knowledge building program. But then we're being told it is a knowledge building program. And is there research behind a knowledge building program? And it's like, by the time you wrap your head around it, you want to go crazy, because people will attack you on social media for hating knowledge when you're just looking for evidence and the research and you just want to help kids.
I think the problem you face is there's some good ideas sitting there, but they're being filtered through a system that's a little bit strange. It seems to me that the system requires this sort of programmization of things, and that the publishers have to do that quickly to get their money. And so it ends up sort of mutating into slightly strange forms. In terms of the core knowledge, look, there's not a huge amount of evidence for core knowledge curricula. I'm sure people that are really close to it would dispute that, but there is some, and it's growing, and there's more research that's coming in. But it's a real slow burn, because if you're trying to build kids' knowledge and show that on standardized assessments that just assess random knowledge, then you've got to build so much knowledge to help them do better on the standardized assessment that it's going to take a long time for that to flow through. And really the evidence argument for knowledge building or core knowledge is not really at the program level, that we've tested these programs and they're effective, although there is some of that evidence. I'm not going to say there isn't. There is some of that evidence. It's more the basic cognitive science. It's more what I was sort of talking about at the start, about long-term memory and our ability, and lighthouses and all that sort of stuff. It's more the basic cognitive science plus a bit of logic as to why we would do certain things the way we would do in the classroom. So there is that element to it as well. But yeah, it sounds like, and the other thing is the science of reading is, I'm aware that's really big in the States, and I'm aware that Emily Hanford's podcast has had a big impact. And thank you, Emily Hanford, because our state education minister listened to that podcast, and he is now convinced of the need for systematic literacy instruction and explicit teaching and things like that, which is great. But it's actually part of a wider science of learning. And I know that term is problematic and people object to it and this, that, and the other, based on a sort of a more wider understanding of cognitive science. And that's probably what I'm trying to do in my work. So the science of reading to me is part of this wider set of interconnected ideas about teaching. And I wonder whether in the States, and it's a question because I'm not there, it's more isolated and it's just this one thing, rather than being seen as part of a wider movement towards knowledge-rich curricula that would affect things like the teaching of history and maths and all these other subjects as well.
I do think that there are people, fighting for what you're talking about, having school be a place of building knowledge. That's what kids are there for, to build knowledge. And I do believe there are people, proponents of that. But it is mixed in, unfortunately, with people wanting to, push people into the direction of buying one over the other, saying one is better than the other when there's really no proof of that. I do think that it's a mess.
But Faith, can I play devil's advocate? As an educator in the field, I do want to know what it has the best evidence and research behind it. And if there is evidence and research that shows something's working better, how do I get that into my hands? Like, for instance, even on Sold the Story, they mentioned something, right? Success for reading, I think it was. Why don't I see it?
For all, success.
Yes.
I don't see it in that many schools. So if people know something is working, wouldn't it make it easier in some ways to have something that we have more evidence? I mean, shouldn't teachers at least have the option to have the best of the best based on the research? Why is it this like marketing thing where it's just like, who has the most money, or which person is loudest, or which one's tweeting the most, that's helping us make informed decisions rather than really informed decisions that are more data-based?
I think there is some evidence for the core knowledge curriculum, some pretty robust, although still quite limited, but robust evidence. I'm not sure there would be, and I don't see how you could have any evidence for curriculums that have been sort of rushed into production due to ideas about the science of reading, because to test a curriculum, it takes a long time. I mean, you've got to teach it for a year, 2 years, have the kids sit a standardized assessment. If someone's just written a curriculum and got it into schools within 3 months, it can't possibly have gone through that process.
Well, that's exactly what we had talked about, Judy, with Maureen Ruby. We had our friend on, really, prominent person in the field, talk about what a curriculum is. And she believes what you believe, Greg, that you work with it, and then the next year, maybe you're pulling something out, or then you're seeing where the gaps are, and you work with it, and it's what you teach and the order that you teach it in. And you have to all decide on, is this important for us? But, with a program, it's basically other people deciding what's important. And then they're throwing in a lot of pieces that can't possibly be taught throughout the whole day. And then teachers are left to pick and choose, or someone is going to do that, or they're teaching everything but the kitchen sink, and it just becomes one big mess. So I'm so glad that we had your perspective. I just want to pull out one more quote, Greg, before we wrap up.
Because, no, you're not going to let him off the hook with the BS and Cheers part.
Well, we're almost there. This is what you had written in your article. We need a curriculum that is full of substance, some of which students may grapple with deeply, and some they will merely acquaint themselves with until the day it becomes key to unlocking a text.
Yep.
Could you please talk a little bit about that? Because I think that is so very, very important, Greg.
So I would, the way I talk about this now, I sort of developed my thinking about it, and I've got some language around it now. Core versus context. So core are the things that we will look at in great detail, and it might be a study of a book. It might be a period of history. It might be a scientific concept. Science works really well for this because there are some obvious core ideas within science. That's the way it's sort of structured. It's very easy to spot them. In history, it's harder, and you have to make some arbitrary choices sometimes. But history gives a good example. So, for instance, if I want, so in the town that I live in, Ballarat, very famous in Australia because it had something called the Eureka Uprising. So this is when gold miners rebelled against the government, which was at the time it was a colony of Britain, and they built a stockade, and the police then sort of raided the stockade. They made a flag, and the flag is very famous, and it's associated with the Union movement in Australia. So our kids, of course, they're going to study the Eureka Rebellion, because you can, the way I'm talking about it, you can already see it's really powerful because it speaks outside of itself and it has connotations to the modern day and all this sort of stuff. But we want them to understand that. We want them to understand the basic story. But there might be other things, like about the food that the miners would eat, or the way they would live, or things about the 18th century that are just context that kids just sort of come across as part of learning about the Eureka Rebellion. And maybe that in the 80s, like it's obvious to us, but it wouldn't be obvious to kids generally who haven't been taught about this, that in the 19th century there were no cars and people went around on horses and that sort of stuff. This is just context, right? And this is this thin layer of stuff that's going to be really useful later on if you're reading a text set in 19th century Australia, being able to orientate yourself because of these things that you've picked up. So there's some really meaty ideas that you want them to grapple with because they're about democracy, or they're about these really cool ideas. But while you're doing it, so you can pepper in this context. So for instance, in history, we don't follow the John Dewey's Expanding Horizons model of social studies. We just teach history, and we teach our very youngest kids about ancient China and things like that. And so they get a sense of these different cultures, different periods of time. They can cope with it just fine. But a lot of what they're going to get from that, we're not setting them a test. We're not quizzing them on ancient China and write an essay on ancient China, 5-year-olds or something like that. We're not doing that. Really, that's all context. It's just building a base, showing them where China is on the globe, where its relationship is to Australia. You'd be surprised how many adults can't find their way around the globe and point to where different countries are. So just that sort of stuff. So that's the context versus the core.
Well, listening to that is so interesting. When you mentioned that the youngest children are learning about ancient China, I think social studies in this country, they learn about their family.
Yeah.
I think they know their family already.
Yeah. That's the Expanding Horizons model, yeah.
So that's the problem. Our social studies curriculum, I'm not talking about a program, but what we see in K1, 2, 3, the lower grades, it's really kind of nothing. Community, and yeah, you could talk about community and family, but what you're talking about is very, very different. Yeah. So I think we could take a lesson from this conversation. One, we need to really look at what's the content that we want to get across K-2 and then above, and is it building? Is it cumulative? I think we have to think about how valuable it is for teachers and administrators to actually think about curriculum as ownership, not just something packaged. I think that would make a huge difference.
Faith, I don't have my button. Give yourself a cheers. Pick up your button, please. Can you repeat the last thing you just said? That was actually awesome.
Thank you. So
do you know what you said?
So Judy, what are we going to say about the BS? I think we have to turn it over to Greg right now. Could you tell us what you think is BS in education right now?
Top 3 things that you think are BS.
3 things you think.
3 things.
Yeah, if you can. If you can.
He could do it. I have faith. He's a smart guy. He has a lot of knowledge, Faith.
3 things. Building thinking classrooms, which is a maths not a program, an approach to teaching maths, which doesn't seem to have any evidence behind it. I think it might be a bit harsh to call it BS, but it's been very widely adopted on with very little evidence. I'm going to be really provocative because I don't know if I even mean this, but our early learning kids do a lot of phonemic awareness, and I've tried to look at the evidence for actual phonemic awareness separated from phonics, and I can't find much. So I'm wondering at the moment whether phonemic awareness is BS. I don't know. What else? I mean, there's so much. I mean, the whole of education is, isn't it? Really, like
Let's just
we
call
grapple it with torrents of the stuff all the time.
And what would you cheer about, Greg? You can.
Well, I think we always talk about the evils of social media and how terrible it is, but it has allowed teachers to talk directly to teachers, often in other countries. When I started my career, the only flow of information was up and down the hierarchy, and if the people above you wanted to implement this program or this approach, that was it, and you couldn't really question it. You didn't have anywhere to go. Now we can talk horizontally to each other, and we can share ideas, and it's really powerful. I think people trying to lead this controversially named science of learning movement are doing really good things. I think in America, you've got two people who I would always read is Emily Hanford and Natalie Wexler, and they don't necessarily always see eye to eye on everything, but I find their work fascinating and really, really useful. Of course, there's loads of people in America who have got plenty to say, but you restricted me to 3 things, so I've picked 3.
Well, thank you so much.
I need to do my shtick today.
Okay, go
So
ahead.
I'm going to work tomorrow. What are my main things that I'm going to focus on tomorrow right away? Like, what am I doing tomorrow that might be a little bit different than today?
Am I answering that?
Yeah,
I don't know, Judy.
I want to walk away confident tomorrow that I'm coming to work a little bit better than I was today.
I feel it would be impertinent for me to attempt to answer that question, Judy. I don't know your kids or your context, and I'm not an expert, so I don't know what you would do differently, because I don't know what you would do. But I would certainly say.
Can I ask you one thing before we go? Because I think I repeated it a couple of times on the show. K-2, 3 to 5. Do you see them a little bit differently? And can you be responsive to your literacy block and switch things as you see your data possibly needs additional levels of support, even if it's like the 3rd or 4th month of school? And then that's it. Then I'll sleep well tonight.
I don't think they're qualitatively different. I think that the key thing is when you start teaching decoding, and the rapid progress kids make in that is something that's never really replicated. You never go from 0 to 50 miles an hour as quickly as you do then. And I think from K to 2, I mean, I could be trite and say K to 2, we're learning to read, 3 to 5, we're reading to learn. That sounds like a nice kind of buzzwordy way of saying things. But I think there's something in that, because the one thing we haven't mentioned, of course, is that if you equip kids to read early, a lot of this knowledge that's an inch wide, they will pick up themselves through reading. So, and that's another important point.
That
meant a lot to me.
That was an excellent way to wrap up. So if we do our jobs well, and we give them the gift of reading themselves, they're going to pick up lots of knowledge. So let's leave it at that. This was a great conversation. Dr. Greg Ashman from Australia, we appreciate you and your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.